over the course of making this film, we're always incredibly inspired by these men. And so, even though the film is very intense and we're seeing a lot of negative things, we're also seeing the best of humanity. We're seeing this incredible resilience that these men have. And when we're all walking around in America right now feeling like we're under certain pressures and there's an evolution of kind of a police state, it's very powerful to be able to see somebody who's in a immeasurably worse situation, who's still managing to protest and to have an impact. You know, they found us, right? They're through their activism and through the noise that they were making and the good trouble that they were making inside in a nonviolent way. They were able to penetrate enough that filmmakers on the outside discovered the work that they had been doing. And now here we are talking about a film that's been seen by millions of people on HBO, and suddenly the state of Alabama is having to take notice. So there's a very big positive, I think, in all of that that comes from the resilience of the men.
I know you're grieving, but I want to tell you that your son was murdered. They sweep stuff underneath the rug all the time.
If you're an inmate in Alabama prison, you're probably praying every night that nothing bad happens to you. It's dangerous and volatile. It could explode at any moment.
I mean, it's corrupt. That's all you can say.
We're finished.
What are we finished with?
Film me.
Why?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hold on a minute. Police in here.
Oh, okay.
Don't talk.
We had record numbers of people leaving out of here in body bags. They don't want the public to see what's really going on the inside.
How can a journalist go into a war zone but can't go into a prison in the United States of America? The state is settling one lawsuit after another. There's no consequences for their actions.
It's not the inmate that's killing them folks. It's for God.
There's an argument that there is some systemic problem within all of our facilities, and I wholeheartedly disagree with that.
How can you defend this?
That one guard, he knew something. I could tell he was a liar.
We are going to pursue it based on the facts to the fullest extent that we're allowed.
Their biggest fear is to see us come together on one accord.
We got to take our power back. We have to come together and make a stand that our life is worth something.
I came to prison in 1985. I know what these folks are doing.
We have been taking life and death risk to get this information out, but we still can.
Okay, here we go. Hi, I'm Chuck Braverman. This is another episode of Westdoc Online. Today we are bringing you a film that is currently on HBO, which is a little unusual that it's so easy for you to tune in and watch the film that we're talking about. And the film is called The Alabama Solution, and it's produced by Andrew Jarecki and Charlotte Kaufman. And let's say hello to Andrew and Charlotte. Hi, guys. How are you?
Hi, Chuck.
And we just discovered in our little pre-show interview that you are sitting in a hotel room in Amsterdam. I am so jealous. I would love to be there. Did you get in this hotel? Do they give you bicycles to ride around the canals, or just big,
I think it's
black,
possible.
Suburban limos to take you to the screening?
What we've learned is that if you get in an Uber, it will say like 25 minutes. And then the driver will say, if I take you to this part of the canal, you can walk there in 3 minutes. And it's because of the circular nature of everything in Amsterdam.
Charlotte, and you come from a showbiz family, I think, right?
Yes, a very different branch of showbiz. Yes.
And what branch would that be, would you say? What would you call it?
The independent horror, cult following, guerrilla, DIY filmmaking branch.
I didn't want any of this. I'm a monster. Hey, buddy, I'm your dad.
so when you were growing up, so did you watch your dad or your parents involved in all this DIY horror guerrilla stuff, or were you involved at all?
Not only did I watch it, I lived it. My dad would use us all for free labor. So uh, the pleasure of acting in any of his films, because when you have your own daughter, you don't have to follow labor law, child labor law. Um, but it was a fantastic experience because it's all about true.
I'm laughing because I
This
have
is
both
how
of
you
my
make.
kids. I worked with me too, and
And did you pay them, fair wage?
well, I mean, what I think of immediately is we were doing a show at Marine Corps boot camp in where is it, South Carolina, right? And I was there for the first week and with my wife, and it was hot and it was muggy and it was like we were in boot camp. And my son Alex was working with me. And after 10 days or maybe less, I turned to Alex and I said, "You're in charge. You're making this movie."
That's good.
And I think he was like 22 years old at the time, or 23, and I don't even remember what he had graduated from. He was going to film school at NYU. And he said, "I can't do this." I said, "Yes, you can." And he did. He did a great job. And that's how his career launched.
You must be very proud of them.
And Max, my other son, when we were doing another show, I said, "You're going to mix the audio in this show," because he knew sound. And he said, "I don't know how to mix the show." And that was 20 years ago, and he's probably mixed 1,000 shows since then.
That's amazing. Well, I gotta say, I'm sure your kids learned a lot from being around you, just absorbing things through osmosis about storytelling and about doing your own thing. And like for me, being around my dad's sets, even though it's so different from what we do now, it was just a model for being an independent storytelling artist. And so I'm grateful for the experience.
And how did you and Andrew end up working together?
So I had been interested in issues having to do with prisons in America because we don't do that very well, and had made a bunch of films that had to do with the justice system in one form or another. And then I was about 7 years ago talking to my daughter, who was 14 and was a big reader, and she was reading a book by a guy named Anthony Ray Hinton, who had been wrongfully convicted in Alabama and wrote a book largely about the prison system. And she said, "I know you're interested in this stuff. We should read this together." So we read the book together, and then we decided to take a road trip to Montgomery. And we met a man there who was the first Black prison chaplain. And he did revival meetings inside the prison, inside the 14 men's prisons in Alabama. And he said, "Well, if you're interested, you should just come in as a volunteer. You'll see what you can see." And then once we knew that there was the opportunity to see into this very opaque, secretive system, I came back to New York and connected with Charlotte, who's somebody that I wanted to work with and has many, many skills as a filmmaker and human. And so we agreed to go down there together, and then miraculously got access to one of the prisons and started to get a picture of not only what we were seeing, but how much we were not being shown. And the men who were incarcerated said to us, "You have to realize that you're being shown a kind of a curated version of what it's like to be in here. You need to get into that dorm over there, which is the behavior modification dorm. You need to go see where people are being kept in solitary confinement. You need to understand the murder rate and the suicide rate in here. This is really a extraordinarily horrible thing that's going on," and asked us to look more closely into it. And then when we left, we learned that there was sort of a network of people who had contraband cell phones inside the prison, and that they were reaching out to us and were able to share video material that they had been recording. And then we were able to interview them and even they became engaged in our process of trying to investigate a murder that happens there. So it was kind of a windy road to get there, but it turned out to be a kind of incredible journey with Charlotte for the last 7 years now.
So I just want to skip back a little bit because normally before we get into the making of the film, which I'm glad you did that transition very smoothly, thank you. You and I, Andrew, met. I'm looking and seeing that Capturing the Freedmans was 2003, so it was probably 2002, and I can't remember exactly how I came across the film. And I don't even know how I ended up taking you to Brooks, inviting you to Brooks up in Ventura for a screening at night to in a filled auditorium that had never heard of the film because it wasn't out and didn't know anything about it. And I remember, and I don't even remember whether I had seen the film before that night or not, because now it's 22 years ago or 23 years ago. But I do remember that it was full and the audience was stunned, and what a positive reaction they had from seeing this film, which of course went on and was extremely successful. And that was probably the beginning for you at HBO, right? At Capturing the Freedmans. Yeah. But as I look at the films that you've made, you know, it seems to me like every time you start a film, you start making it about one thing and it ends up about something else more dramatic, including the Alabama Solution, which, like, it's not a good thing. Invite Andrew to make a film about something and it'll end up being about somebody killing somebody. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that may be true.
Capturing the Freedmans, and then you did a little 12-part series called The Jinx, which seemed to be on HBO for 4 years, off and on. I mean, probably more than that, actually.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I have to comment that you have an incredible memory for a man in, I assume, your mid-60s, and so I'm very impressed by that. I, by the way, happen to know how old you are because I asked you not long ago. But I won't reveal that unless you do. And when we met, it was at the very beginning of Capturing the Freedmans sort of finding its way into the world. And I remember going to that screening because it was so fascinating to see people react to that film. And when we eventually released it in theaters, I don't know if you remember when films used to appear in theaters, but that happened. When we put it out in theaters, we were getting phone calls from the distributors saying there's a problem at the theaters. And I said, is there a problem with the projection or something? And they said, no, it's the people are coming to see the film and then they're not leaving at the end. So we can't get ready for the next show because they're arguing with each other in the auditorium. And it was just clear that the film had really activated people who had different opinions about the story. And we've seen, that I think that's lucky when you have that and you're opening people's minds to that. So I remember really appreciating the ability to show it to people when, you took me to a place I'd never been before, and hopefully we get to do it again.
I hope so. And I'm just wondering, and I should have checked before, but do you know, is Capturing the Freedmans is it on? If you go to HBO, can you find it?
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah. And it's still
something else,
still watched quite a lot.
Something else that I just remembered, as my memory comes in and out, is somehow, maybe it was because I knew you from Capturing the Freedmans, you correct me if you remember better than me, but I was in New York, and maybe we said hello or had lunch or something, but you told me that you were working on another project. I don't even know if it had the title of Catfish yet or not. And we ended up premiering the original Catfish film at our Westdoc live event in Santa Monica, of which, again, I think that shocked people to sort of wake up as to what was happening. And then, you could say, well, what happened to the film afterwards? How many episodes of Catfish did you end up producing?
Yeah, I mean, it's still on, it morphed into a series on MTV, which has now been on for 12 years. But it was interesting because, you probably, I know you know Sheila Nevins, and it wasn't a HBO film, the documentary Catfish, a film that I really love, and is quite a deep film. And I showed it to Sheila just because I like to show things to Sheila. I always get good feedback. And she called me and she said, I hated it. And I said, how is that possible? Like, why did you hate it? And she said, well, it's obviously fake. And I said, I, I assure you it's not fake. Why do you think it's fake? And she said, well, I just can't imagine that anybody would really um, pretend to be somebody else on the internet and somehow nobody would turn their camera on, and it just doesn't make any sense. And this is just a once in a million situation. And then the fact that there were hundreds of very similar circumstances that got documented in the television show. I think I have to ask Sheila now, like, it turns out that the phenomenon of people pretending to be other people on the internet is not only very prevalent, but it sort of comes from a deep place, I think, which is, the desire for people to feel loved and to make a connection with other people. But it was, maybe she'll like the film better now. I don't know.
Maybe your film inspired some people to catfish other people.
That is certainly a possibility.
Maybe
But
I
there were
shouldn't have said
enough.
that.
But there were enough. There were some. It In the beginning, I remember people were starting to use the word catfish, and then they would get a letter from the distributor saying, like, that's a trademark for the film, don't use it. And then one day, we heard from the Webster's dictionary that they were putting the word catfish into the dictionary as a secondary meaning for that word was going to be people pretending to be other people on the internet. And then once it was in the dictionary, everybody said, well, now we can use it. And we were kind of happy enough with that because it is a phenomenon that was fascinating.
And you were relieved that they weren't saying Jarecki instead of catfish, probably, right?
Yeah, I think.
So this film, let's go back to the Alabama Solution, which I watched again yesterday. It's just,
Thank you.
I think it's heavier, if that's possible, even the second time than the first time. And it's more amazing, and it's more disturbing, and it's more upsetting than ever. And the film is basically about the corruption and slavery that's going on in all of the state of Alabama prisons, where it basically seems on the film, the surface, correct me if I'm wrong, but it certainly seems like they've decided in Alabama that we have these X number of thousands of prisoners, and why don't we just pay them nothing or practically nothing and force them to work 7 days a week, and the state of Alabama can gross $450 million from their labor, and the heck with everything else, and we don't have to do anything or even let them out of prison after any number of years. And if we have to kill them to keep them in line, that seems like what's going on there. I mean, it's beyond shocking, isn't it? In this year that this can happen. And what's almost more shocking is that they let you into prison with a camera to film anything, and the fact that all the prisoners can buy cell phones and drugs and who knows what else from the guards, and that anybody can you talk and FaceTime on through from the prison. What am I missing here?
No, that's the truth, and I think it is shocking when you see it, and it feels like, how do we not know about this? This is such a massive scale of human suffering and exploitation and abuse. But the reason, we don't know about it is because prisons all throughout the country are very, very secret. There have been Supreme Court rulings that have limited the public and the press access to prisons and given wardens very wide control over who gets to come in. And what that has allowed is a sort of myth about what prisons actually are, debilitating, or they're corrections, they're correcting. But what you see in Alabama is it's the opposite of that. It's not making us safer. And I think, based on our research, it's across the country, because when you combine secrecy and authoritarian power, bad things are going to happen. So it is shocking. I think, we hope that the audience watching the film would experience the same waves of shock that we felt investigating over the years, obviously compressed, but that all of those feelings you just expressed is what we went through also in making all of these discoveries and filming.
So the opening of the film that I assume was part of the revival meeting that they wanted you to film in the beginning. There's a band and they have nice food, and then one of the prisoners comes up to you and says something like, "This isn't the food that we get. We never see food as good as this fried chicken," or whatever it was, right? What was the point that either of you thought, I think there might be a film here? Because you didn't know all that material that you were going to get, and you probably didn't know what was going on there. What was the evolution to getting into making a film?
Well, we didn't know what was going on inside the prisons. We had a suspicion that the Alabama state prisons were extremely bad. But as Charlotte says, the prisons are sort of like black sites, and you're not really allowed in. Journalists are not allowed in. And if we had applied through the usual channels, they would have said, absolutely not. We're not letting you bring cameras into these institutions. And they would have a bunch of reasons for that. Well, we can't guarantee your safety. These are very dangerous institutions. Of course, when we got in, we were not in any way afraid of the people who were incarcerated there. If anything, it was the administration and the guards that made us more uncomfortable. But when we were able to get into this one prison, the warden said to us, "You're probably wondering why I let you in to film today, and why I didn't call Montgomery to get permission, because they would have said no." And I said, "Yeah, I'm curious about that." And he said, "Well, I know that you're making a Christian film, and I think, this is a hard place, and I think we need that." We certainly didn't set out to make a Christian film, although you could argue there are a lot of Christian values that are being violated in those prisons. But once we were able to film once in one of the facilities, the men started whispering to us about things that were happening and saying, "They're only letting you see a tiny sliver of what's happening in this prison. You need to go over to that dorm and see what's happening. You need to go over to where solitary confinement is being used on people for 5 or 7 years at a time. There's so much that they're not showing you, and we want to tell you the story, but we're not going to be able to tell it to you here." And then when we left, we discovered that there was this network of people with cell phones, which is certainly not allowed in the system. It's a giant tear in the fabric of secrecy, but it's also sort of inevitable because, it's ironic that the guards are selling the cell phones to the people in the prison, and then that's what is being used in our film to reveal what's really happening there.
So the film has been on HBO for, 6 weeks or a couple of months. What, if any, consequence or reaction has been taking place in the state of Alabama and the prison systems or the state government or anything because of the film?
Well, there was sort of a history of secrecy around all of what was happening in the state prison system. And there were a lot of families that found out that their loved one had died. They didn't have information. Sometimes they weren't even getting a phone call about it until 2 weeks had gone by. Sometimes that was because there was a sinister situation with a guard. So we knew that all of this had been secret, and all these families who had lost loved ones had felt alone. And so when the film came out, I think people really started to respond to it in a way that we hadn't anticipated. And there was a real groundswell of support in the state. So the film came out, I don't know, maybe 5 weeks ago. And about 10 days later, there was a meeting of what they call the Prison Oversight Board, which has been a pretty toothless organization that just meets and, moves the vegetables around and doesn't really do anything of substance. And they also don't even invite public comment. So the public didn't show up at these meetings. And then suddenly there was a meeting where, 100+ people showed up, and they had to move the whole meeting to another room. People showed up with signs, and people showed up to protest. And one of the legislators got up and said, we've been talking about the prison system now for the last 30 minutes. Nobody's mentioned the film. I think we've all seen the film. And so it was clear that a lot of the people who had felt like they were in the shadows were in a position to come out and really start talking about these issues, and realizing that they have a voice, and that they had an experience that was not limited to their own family, that many families had been destroyed by this system. So, and there's a pretty elaborate sort of impact campaign that's going on around the film. Part of it is to protect the men who participated in the film, because they have for a long time put themselves at risk by using these cell phones, by being able to, speak out. And there've just been, this was sort of the first part of it for us, is just making sure that the men are protected. And then beyond that, there's an effort to really make a difference in Alabama, and to press for change in Alabama, and to, shine the light on that system, which has not had a light on it in a long time.
So at the end of the day, do you think their conditions are going to change for the better?
We were really worried about the safety of the men who participated in this film. As you see in the film, they had been retaliated against before, and we were bracing for the possibility that after the film's release, they would get taken to solitary confinement or worse. And so far, that has not happened. And, we'd like to think that the reason for that is because the film has created enough exposure, and enough people have said, like, I care about these people, that the administration is thinking twice before resorting to their usual retribution. And so if that is if we can apply that example, then maybe there'll be other things that they think twice about, because they realize the public is paying attention and people are paying attention. But I think really, in order to truly change conditions in Alabama's prisons, and permanently and across America, we have to do a narrative shift about what prisons are. And they can't be secret institutions that are primarily about punishment. So it's, and hopefully this film contributes to that. And we'll also see in Alabama's the next legislative session, I think there are some bills that will be entered, and that could have some potential to really improve things. But it's always, in a tough on crime state, it's a fight.
But it's really important to know that when we lock people away and mistreat them, either because we want to have retribution or something, we have to recognize that 95% of those people are coming out of prison, and they're going to rejoin society. And if the way we treat them when they're in prison is to traumatize them, to subject them to torture of various forms, including mental torture, being in solitary confinement, not having anybody to communicate with, which the UN identified that as torture for human beings who are social animals. If we have that kind of approach to the people when they're incarcerated, then when they come out, we can't very well expect them to rejoin society, to be able to have a trade, to be able to earn a living. And then we're surprised that there's recidivism, and we chalk it up to, well, I guess that person's just broken and they'll never be good again. Meantime, if we had actually taught them how to do how to perform functions in society, which many of them are very eager to do. They're coming out of often very little schooling. They don't have a lot of vocational training in it, certainly in a state like Alabama, but across the country. And so if you don't give them the tools to rejoin society, they're not going to be able to rejoin society in a functional way, and they're just going to have this continued cycle of violence.
Thank you guys very much for coming on Westdoc. I think your film is very, very powerful, and I want to congratulate you on making a shocking, dramatic, successful film. And I hope it has an impact on Alabama and the rest of the states too, which should, needless to say, I think what you're doing is very powerful. And I think it's one of the reasons that a lot of filmmakers decided to get into documentary in the first place.